Today we're going to go over the third and final message on the marriage supper. First, we started off with what it was and who was going to be at the marriage supper. And then last week we covered where it will actually take place. And this week, of course, we're going to go over when it will take place. And to understand this, it is going to be helpful to know a little bit about the order of the end time events. On our site, thegreaterchurchofgod.org, I put together a little chart some time back that if you go under the literature and charts, you'll see one on the 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 plagues. And it would be helpful to grab that real quick to follow along. And we're going to start by going over it just a little bit to kind of give us an idea of where we're heading and what is necessary to know to try to figure out some of the things about when the marriage supper will actually take place. Now, you have the seals, then the trumpets, and then the plagues. I always kind of remember it STP, the old oil company, or Systematic Theology Project, or Standard Temperature and Pressure, whatever anagram that you might have. The mnemonic for me is always STP. You have the 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 plagues. The 7th seal is composed of the 7 trumpets. The 7th trumpet is composed of the 7 plagues. So they're all kind of subsets of each other, all under the greater heading of the 7th seal. Now, the first 4, or the 4 horsemen as we call them, are religious deception, war, famine, and pestilence. All right. Through those, 25% of the world are going to die initially when these seals are opened here in the end time. Next, we have the Great Tribulation, which is the 5th, the heavenly signs, which is the 6th, and then the 7th one is the Day of the Lord. Okay, that is composed of 7 trumpets, right? So now this Day of the Lord is supposed to go on for about a year. Now, if you want to put Isaiah 34 and verse 8 in your notes, it says, "For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, the year of recompense for the cause of Zion." So again, even if we didn't understand the day for a year principle, which is outlined in a couple different places in the Bible, and I think we went over that last week, we see here that Isaiah kind of outlines it for us anyway and says, okay, this day of the Lord is going to be a year. And so as we go through this, you always kind of keep that in the back of your mind in terms of how long these things are actually going to be going on and happening. So the 7 trumpets then, which again go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the 7th one, the 7th trump, the last trump, which we'll get into here in a little bit, is composed of 7 plagues. Right? So for today, it becomes necessary for us to understand that 7th and last trump and the timeline of it and how long that will take, and show the feasibility of the marriage supper happening during that time. So we're going to go through that, and we're going to insert a lot of different scriptures from here and there. Hopefully we can follow as usual. It'll be on the website. But I tried to make this as chronologically accurate as possible and going forward, and pulled in all the information that was necessary to paint a very complete picture of what is going to be happening in the very end. All right, so we have a year that all of this is to take place. That is the 7 trumpets as well as the 7 plagues, of course, which is the 7th trump is the last 7 plagues. So let's begin in Matthew 24 and verse 30. And we'll read verse 30 and 31. Matthew 24, verses 30 and 31. And of course, what we see here is the Olivet prophecy. It's Christ's prophecy. We've gone over the Matthew 24 not only sporadically throughout the years, but even set aside a message where we went through just Matthew 24. Actually, I think it was 2 sermons. Anyway, Matthew 24 and verse 30, it's Christ speaking. He's given this prophecy. They were asking about the signs of the times and what would be the sign of his coming. And he goes through a litany of different events that are going to happen. Picking up the story in verse 30, it says, "Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." All right, so what is this sign, first off? It's not the lightning. That was 3 verses earlier where it talks about in verse 27 of Matthew 24, the lightning coming from the east and flashes to the west, and so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Right? So again, we've now moved on 3 more verses, and there is this other sign. And I think Revelation 15 and verse 1 refers to that sign. So of course, keep your finger here for just a second. And in Revelation 15 and verse 1, I think we have what is that sign. Now, it doesn't actually come out and explain it exactly, but we see what is accompanying this sign, and there's going to be something, and it's going to let us know, and with it comes another thing that we're looking at here. So Revelation 15 and verse 1 says, "Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them the wrath of God is complete." It's all summed up, it's finalized. The day of the Lord is over after the 7 last plagues. But he says, I saw a sign, I saw another sign in heaven, and with it came the 7 last plagues. So this is the 7th trump, this is the last trump. Christ is coming, and he's bringing the 7 plagues with him. So back to Matthew 24. So the sign here in verse 30 appears to be the 7 angels having the 7 last plagues. And of course, the tribes of the earth will mourn. They are mourning because they've just been through not only the 6 seals and going through the 7th seal, but they've been through all the trumpets as well. And now here it comes, the last bit. Again, this, it's a purposeful thing that God's doing. He does it in a specific way to bring about his plan. So continuing in verse 31 of Matthew 24, it says, "And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other." So Christ is returning in the clouds. Right? He hasn't returned yet, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but he's returning in the clouds, and he's just in this process of coming back, and the trumpet is sounded to gather the elect. Let's turn over to 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 16 and 17. 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 16 and 17. Again, I try to emphasize certain words here as we go along. The clouds, we're going to continue to see clouds appear, and how this all, again, hopefully gives us a very visual image of the return of Christ and what is going on at that time. For me, I find it helpful to kind of see these things, playing kind of like as a movie in your mind. 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 16 and 17. "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first." All right, so God is descending from heaven with his shout, with the trumpet, the voice of an archangel, the trumpet of God, and the dead will rise first. And then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. Speaking of the first resurrection of his saints, of those who have been called throughout the history of time. Those are the ones who are dead, who are in the ground awaiting his return, in this, what the Bible terms asleep, but it's just a dreamless, consciousless existence where you're in the ground and waiting, figuratively, for Christ to return. And it says that we'll be caught up together in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So it's very clear that we rise up to meet him as he is coming down, or he's already there. And these 2 events are happening at the same time, at the last trump. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 and 52. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 and 52. Again, familiar scripture, putting it together, showing you exactly what's happening, when it's happening. And it says in 1 Corinthians 15, which is the resurrection chapter, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep." That's the term I was talking about, being dead in the ground. "But we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. So this is the change that was talked about, when Christ was talking to Nicodemus. This is a change that we're looking forward to. It's a change to being a spirit being at this time. Only spirit can inherit the kingdom of God. So it is this resurrection to immortality from mortality. It is a raising, as it was mentioned there in verse 52, to incorruptibility from corruptibility. Of course, as we wait, quote unquote, in the grave, there's this corruption that happens to our body. But we're going to be raised into an incorruptible body that will never change, that is not subject to the wear and tear of time. But we see this happening, this change happening at the last trump. There is this immediate change, and then we go up in the clouds to meet him as he's coming down, or as he is already there waiting for us. Now, Revelation 11, verses 11 and 12. Let's just make it just a little bit more clear exactly what's happening. This is talking about the two witnesses, okay, who have gone around and they have been preaching and doing certain miracles, and then for their troubles, they are killed and they're left in the street. And then verse 11, after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them, and they heard a loud voice from heaven saying, "Come up here." And they ascended to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies saw them. Again, I think we talked about this last week, that there are 3 heavens that are mentioned, right? The first heaven is the sky, the second heaven is outer space, and the third heaven is where God exists. And we, again, don't want to belabor that point, but what we're seeing here, though, when we put all the scripture together, is that they ascended into the first heaven where Christ was waiting, because they are part of this, the firstborn, the first fruits. They're going to be resurrected at the return of Christ, at the last trump. But the main point here that I wanted to point out is that they ascended to heaven in a cloud, right? So Christ is coming down on a cloud, we're going up on a cloud, and in the same manner that Christ did for his resurrection. So there are these parallels for sure. In fact, Acts 1 verses 9 through 12. This is how Christ did it. And there's been some parallels, if you recall, where we're talking about the wave sheaf offering and how Christ goes up and he's presented to the Father as the wave sheaf, and it would stand to reason then we, as the wave loaves, which is represented in Pentecost, would go and do the same. And here it is that we see in Acts 1:9, the recording of him leaving and how he left. And also, then it mentions a couple of other things that we'll take note of here in the latter verses. So Acts 1, verses 9 through 12. Now when he had spoken these things, while they watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. So again, he went up on a cloud in much the same way that we will be doing it in the future. And while they looked steadfastly towards heaven, he went up, and behold, 2 men, who were not men, but angels, stood by them in white apparel, and said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into the heaven? This same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner." So he's going to come back in a cloud that we've been talking about here. And as you saw him go into heaven, right? So again, keep that in perspective, what heavens we're talking about. And so then, verse 12, then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet. So this was happening on the Mount of Olives, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day journey. So what we're seeing here, though, okay, at this point, in terms of the logistics of what's happened, is that Christ comes down in a cloud, and we go up in a cloud to meet him, okay, above the earth in the first heaven somewhere. But Christ has not yet returned to earth, all right? He is in the process of returning to earth, okay? So we also see that he left from the Mount of Olives, and that he is going to come back to the Mountain of Olives in a similar manner, and he's going to come back to the Mount of Olives. In fact, let's turn over to Zechariah 14. Zechariah 14 and verse 1. Zechariah 14 and verse 1. Be sure and put your marker here because we're going to be coming in and out of this passage. And we're going to read down, probably down to about verse 7. So Zechariah 14 and verse 1 says, "Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst." All right, so hold your finger here. Let's go back to Revelation 16. And let's look at the sixth plague, the second to last plague, okay, when everything's about to be all wrapped up and the wrath of God that is coming upon the world is finished in terms of this return plan that he has. Revelation 16, verses 12 through 16. All right, and it'll become more apparent why we are going to the sixth plague here when we get to the next verse in Zechariah. Revelation 16 and verse 12. "Then the sixth angel poured out his bowl, the plagues, on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. And I saw three unclean spirits like frogs coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are spirits of demons performing signs which go out to the kings of the earth and the whole world to gather them to battle of that great day of God Almighty. Because, behold, I am coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garment, lest he walk naked and they see his shame." Verse 16. "And they gather them together to the place in Hebrew, Armageddon." Now, what a great source of confusion this has been to most of humanity, is that everybody thinks that this is where the battle is going to take place. And it specifically says, is gathering them there. This is a staging place. And this place actually still exists. I mean, if you wanted to Google it, you could go on to Google and put in Megiddo, okay? It's Har Megiddo, which means hill. Har just means hill or mount or mountain. And they put that in front of it. So you have Har Megiddo, and it's this hill that's about 55 miles to the north of Jerusalem, at least as the crow flies. And there's not going to be the battle there, all right? Notice now, let's go back to Zechariah 14 and verse 2 and see what happens, though, after they gather in Armageddon. Zechariah 14 and verse 2, it says, "For I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem." So now they need to make their way from Armageddon, all right? It's, I think, 90 miles by road, but 55 miles by the way the crow flies. So you're looking at, a couple hours drive, maybe, at a very conservative rate to get there, right? So it's not that far away, but you have to move not just one vehicle, but all of the whole armies, or all the armies that are gathered there. But they have to come down to Jerusalem. And once they get there, notice what happens. "The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, the women ravished, half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city." All right, so God brings them against Jerusalem for a cause. And you might just put chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, which talks about, again, this kind of prophecy that's going to take place. And 14, verse 2, looks like it's the fulfillment of the prophecy in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 12. Again, all of that's still in the future here. Now, continuing on with verse 3 of Zechariah 14, "Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle." All right, now the New King James here leaves out a word, yom, which means day, like Yom Kippur, the day of, of atonement. And others, I think, translate this as when, which is, I think, good enough, and it's good in the sense of what's going on here. But the literal version says, "Jehovah went out and shall go out and fight against the nations like the day he fought in the day of battle." So like the day he fought in the day of battle is a reference back to Joshua. So again, once again, keep your finger here. Let's go back to Joshua 10. Just want to make a point about what happened in that battle on that day. In fact, we'll make 3 points as we go through Joshua 10, verses 11, 13, and 14. So basically 11 through 14. Joshua 10, verse 11 is where we will begin. Joshua 10 and verse 11. And it happened as they fled before Israel and were on the descent of Beth Horon, that the Lord cast down large hailstones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from hailstones than the children of Israel killed with the sword. So again, I wanted to make a correlation that we'll make later, but God intervened using hailstones, and actually more of them were killed than by God with the hailstones than were killed by Joshua and his army. Verse 13. So, and here's the incident that was happening. The sun stood still. It was a time when Joshua, reached out to God to, still, quote unquote, stop the sun and moon where they were. And of course, we know that's not what happened, but from his advantage point, that's what it looks like is happening, is that they stopped until the people had revenge on the enemies. So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. All right, so we have that supernatural event that happened there that obviously God intervened so that Joshua and what they had to do could be accomplished that day. And then verse 14, there has been no day like that before it or after it that the Lord heeded the voice of a man, the more salient point here. For the Lord fought for Israel. All right, so we see what's going on here is that, okay, God intervened because he was fighting for Israel. And I think this is what the allusion is in Zechariah 14 and verse 3, is that he's saying, okay, I'm going to fight for you like that day. And interestingly enough, even perhaps in that same exact manner, if this is what's being referred to in Zechariah 14:3. But let's turn back to Revelation 16 and look at the seventh plague, the seventh and final plague. Revelation 16, verses 17 through 19. Oops, no, we'll go down to 21. Revelation 16, verses 17 through 21. So we have the seventh angel, verse 17, who's pouring out his bowl. And let me just point this out in verse 21. It says, and great hail from heaven fell upon men, each hailstone about the weight of a talent. And men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, since that plague was exceedingly great. So here we are, the seventh plague, which is now, we're going to make this correlation back to Zechariah 14 in a second. But we see, so Zechariah 14 refers to Joshua, okay, to the battle in that day, as, he says, this is what I did back in that day. And it's interesting because he fought for Israel and he used hailstones. And it looks like in exactly the same way that he's going to do it in the future. He's fighting for Israel, right? In the nation, the state there, coming back to the mount, towards the Mount of Olives, and where all this stuff is going to be happening. And he's going to use hailstones. But let's go back and finish up the verses in order now. So the seventh angel poured out his bowl or his plague into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple of heaven from the throne saying, it is done. Okay, this is it, the final one. And there were noises and thunderings and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such a mighty and great earthquake as had not occurred since men were on the earth. The greatest of all time is going to happen, still yet to happen. Now that great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. So again, this is imagery that's used a few times, this cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath, in different ways in terms of what happens in the visualization is that of a wine press. I don't know if you've ever seen one of the wine presses, but they can be quite a large vat where they just throw all these red grapes into. And then it comes down, they have kind of a lid that presses down, and they can kind of screw it down tighter and tighter and tighter, and just starts pushing out the the grape juice, the wine, the red wine, or what's going to become red wine. And this is what he's kind of alluding to here, is that that's how he's coming down. He's going to harvest these grapes. He's going to throw them in there, and it's going to squish it out, and blood is going to run everywhere. And we'll talk, and I think we're going to see this a few more times as we go down through what's going to happen here in the very end. And then verse 20 of Revelation 16, the island, and then every island fled away, and the mountains were not found, and great hail from heaven fell upon men, as we read before, this plague of hail that was exceedingly great. So we see then that this is the stuff that's going to happen, and this is going to happen here in this final bout between God and man, and he's going to bring it all to an end, and he's coming back as King of Kings and Lord of Lords in might and power with a rod of iron. Not the way he came the first time, and many of the Jews were expecting him to come that way the first time, but he came and he had to accomplish the other part first. Now, this is his second return. Let's turn over to Joel 3 and verse 2. All right, so we're still painting this picture. Okay, so what happens is that the armies gather at Armageddon, then they come up to Jerusalem, and they are the hand of God, as it were. God is using the army to punish those in Jerusalem because they have left his way, they've gone astray, and it is to bring about a change in them. And so he has a purpose. But then what happens after that? Well, Joel 3 verses 2, and we'll read 12 and 13 as well, of what is going to then take place after that. Joel 3 and verse 2. I will also gather all nations. Okay, so he's gathering them. We're talking about Armageddon. But then he's going to bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is the modern area of Kidron Valley. And he says, and I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people. So again, what they've been doing to his people. Is my heritage, Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations. They have also divided up my land. So they came in and did things that typically, people get carried away and they do more than what they're supposed to. And they believe that it is themselves that are earning this victory when they don't realize that God has his hand in the picture. So then again, verse 12, it's reiterated. Let the nations be wakened, come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. So again, we're talking about these nations that have come in and all the nations that have besieged Jerusalem over time. And he goes, verse 13, put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, go down, for the winepress is full, the vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. So again, once again, that imagery, and it helps to tie in all these things so we see what's happening. This final battle, okay, that's happening here at the time of the seventh plague, that, again, it's going to be a very bloody, one-sided, and I believe very quick battle. Let's turn over to Revelation 14 now. Revelation 14. And again, I want to show just another part of what's going on, because it's not just God who is fighting. Right? It is not just him by himself. He will be bringing his first fruits with him. Revelation 14 is about the 144,000. And we skip down to verse 14, and we'll read down to verse 20. Revelation 14 through 20. He says, then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having in his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. So again, we see a repetition of these events that we're bringing together and finding out just little different parts of each to paint a complete and whole picture. Now, he's coming on the cloud, and he has his sickle, right? And what's that sickle for? Well, we talked about that harvest and the wine press and the vats and the flowing out of all the red juice symbolizing blood. Verse 15, and another angel came to the temple crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud. All right, so this is Christ. He's on the cloud. He's returning, and we're going to go up to meet him there. And he says, thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So he who sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. This is the time of the vengeance of God, where they reap the due punishment that goes with the sins and abominations that have been committed. So then another angel came out of the temple, verse 17, which is in heaven, also having a sharp sickle. And another angel came from the altar who had power over fire, and he cried with a loud cry to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, thrust in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. And the angel thrust his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trampled outside the city, and blood came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles for 1,600 furlongs. So Jehoshaphat's valley, or the Kidron Valley, lies right there between the temple and the Mount of Olives. So Christ is coming back to the Mount of Olives on the east of the temple, and from Jerusalem, we have the armies coming. And so you have this valley where these things are going to be happening, and it's going to be such a lopsided victory that, again, the blood doesn't seem like it's going to have a place to go because it happens so quickly that it's going to rise up to the horses' bridles. It's going to be flowing, okay, in that valley. And so we're talking, what's that, 4 feet, at least or so to the bridle, to the mouth of a horse. And it's for 1,600 furlongs. So it's not going to be a little, but it's going to be a bloody battle. So back to Zechariah 14 and verse 4. So we see these things all transpiring, right? And now verse 4 of Zechariah 14, it says, in that day, again, an allusion to the day of the Lord, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall split in two from east to west, making a very large valley, and half of the mountain shall move towards the north, and half toward the south. And what we see is that it provides a way of escape for those who are left in Jerusalem, who are being besieged. And so they flee, verse 5, through the mountain. They say, then you shall flee through my mountain valley, for the mountain valley shall reach to Azal. Yes, you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Thus the Lord my God will come, and all the saints with you. Okay, so the people from Jerusalem appear to flee through the Mount of Olives, but the significant part here, the other one, is that the saints will be with you. Now, these saints are the ones that were in Revelation 14, where we just talking about. These are the 144,000, the first fruits, the ones that are going to be resurrected. They will return with God. So we see then that they go up in the cloud, they meet him, and here, now in verse 5, as they come back down towards the end of this seventh plague, is that the saints are with him. And we'll see this even a little more clearly towards the end of the message today. So now, though, that we've established the order of events, okay, we have Christ who is going to begin his return and bring the 7 last plagues with him at the last trump. We're going to rise up and we're going to be with him in the air, okay, for the duration of the 7th trump, which will blow basically for the entirety of the 7 plagues. So that whole time, okay, we're going up and we will be with him that whole time, and it's not until the very end that we come back with him. So Christ is returning during that time, and technically, he does not complete his return. He is returning. He has not returned yet. So he's not setting his foot on the Mount of Olives. So this is the return of Christ. By the time he gets to the Mount of Olives and puts his feet there, Christ has now officially returned for the second time to earth. And we will be with him at that time. Right? Now, continuing on in Zechariah 14 and verse 6, okay, we're kind of transitioning here to another thought, but it says, it shall come to pass in that day that there will be no light, the lights will diminish. It shall be one day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time it shall happen that it will be light. All right, so there's a thought that these things, that the seven last plagues, much less the last two, happen in a day. So we've gone through this, all right, tried to put it all together to show that when the armies, okay, first off, the armies have to be gathered to Armageddon from wherever they are. That's going to take time. Then once they're there, right, then they're going to have to move down to Jerusalem, all of them. Then, after that, they go to Jerusalem, they rifle the houses, ravish the women, put half the city into captivity, and then you have to go fight the Lord in the valley of Jehoshaphat. Okay, so perhaps the last plague, the seventh one, can happen in a day, and we talked about how quickly that could happen. But I don't think the sixth one as well, much less all the others. Right? So there are people who think that all this can happen in one day because of these verses here that we're reading in Zechariah 14, verses 6 and 7. So the other thing that we need to consider as well is that there are different connotations for day. That it can be 24 hours, it can be a year, it can be even 1,000 years. And in Zechariah 14 specifically, even after this verse, after verse 7, in that day is used to refer to the millennial reign where earth is going to become this paradise. So definitely not this time of the plagues and the war and the blood running deep. So the reason that we're making somewhat of a point on this is that people say, oh, all this happens in a day, and so there is no time for the marriage supper, for this return to heaven, because it all happens so quickly. Well, okay, even if that was true, right? Even if that speculation was true, and again, it's based on these scriptures here that they take out of Zechariah, there are still other mitigating factors that we have to take into account in terms of that. Okay, one of them being is that when Christ went, okay, whenever he was accepted before God as that wave sheaf offering, we went over that last week, is that he went there and came back in the same day and did everything that he needed to do. So there's no difficulty in us being able to do that, right? So what we have then is, it could still happen if it was only a day, but as we've already seen, it's already going to be more than a 24-hour period. It has to be in terms of these just, for the last two plagues alone. So what we have is, okay, how long then will the seven plagues last? Well, you have the seventh seal, okay, which is the day of the Lord, which is 1 year, like we discussed before. Okay, so it depends then on how long it's going to take for the first six trumpets. Okay, and that way, that's going to dictate how much is left for the seven last plagues. So you have the six trumpets, and then the seventh trumpet is composed of the seven plagues. So that last seventh trumpet is going to then take up the remainder of whatever has not been used up for the first six trumpets of the year. And so some of them, like the fifth trumpet, last for 5 months all by itself. Some are going to be shorter, and I don't know that they're going to be longer than 5 months. It seems unlikely. But so you have some that are longer and some that are shorter as a whole, right? With the fifth one being probably the longest one at 5 months. So without even speculating on how much time that all will take up, they can't all happen at once. And here's the thing, too, that we have to take into consideration in terms of how long the seven last plagues will go, is that there has to be an allowance for the effectiveness of each plague to take place. God's just not necessarily going to hit them and say, okay, we're going to hit you with all seven. Well, we already saw with the sixth and seventh plague that they happen sequentially. And it really does seem like all these are going to happen one after the other, not all at the same time. Otherwise, you're just so completely overwhelmed and you don't get the picture, and you're not being progressed as a human on earth towards what God is trying to accomplish. All right? In fact, let's go over to Revelation 16. verses 8 through 11. This is the fourth and fifth plague. Revelation 16, verses 8 through 11. God is not a wrathful or sadistic God in that respect. He doesn't do it for just that reason. He has a goal that he is trying to accomplish. And we see it here. And this is, again, might not be a surprise to you, but it is the theme that runs basically throughout the whole Bible, and it is all that God wants of us. In Revelation 16, verses 8 through 11, it says, "The fourth angel poured out his bowl or plague on the sun, and power was given to him to scorch men with fire. And men were scorched with great heat, and they blasphemed the name of God." They cursed God instead of turning and changing like he wants. Who has power over the plagues? He's the one that can stop it and change it if you just do what he says. "And they did not repent and give him glory." Right? That's what he wants. He just wants repentance, a change, turning from the wrong direction that they're going and heading towards him in the right direction and doing the things that he knows is best for us, the things that we should be doing. Verse 10, "The fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom became full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues because of pain. They blasphemed God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and they did not repent of their deeds." So we see then that God is just trying to bring them to repentance through these things. And I think it would be overwhelming, or it'd be lost on them if you did them all at once. And I think that we can see the consecutive nature of them, and that they can be overlapping, or that they can continue to last. We know that that's going to be true, that they're going to be overlapping, because we even look at the fact that if all the sea creatures die in the ocean, okay, which is the second plague, then they're not coming back, and that condition will continue to exist throughout the rest of the last plagues. So obviously the effects are going to be felt in subsequent plagues. So we have the seven plagues. So basically, again, if you want to look at your outline, it's the plagues are this loathsome and foul sore. Every living creature is dying. Again, I made these very short and to the point. It would behoove you to go back and look and see exactly what the Bible says. So all the creatures in the sea, which is the salt water, die. And then he causes the sweet water supply to become blood. All right, so that both the water supplies are contaminated. Scorches mankind, causes total darkness, which is 5, prepares for Armageddon, and then causes the greatest earthquake and all the other things. And that's the seventh plague. So we have these, and the reason we go over them is like, okay, if he causes this sore, how long is it then? Does he let that sit and fester or whatever it may do before he's ready to move on? I mean, you do that, you let them feel this and see this and try to get them to change their ways. And then when they don't, he comes with another one, and then another one, and another one, and so on and so forth. So when we look at how long it could take, okay, the remainder of the time that wasn't taken up by the first 6 trumpets, then it's hard to definitely come up with, I mean, again, it'd be all speculative, and we could write our own narrative to figure out, amount of time that it would take, and we could, but again, it would still be speculation. But what we definitely have is enough time for the marriage and supper to happen. And this is just based on a physical perspective, right? Look, back to this one-day theory, even if all this stuff happened in one day and it happened at one time, okay, we have that example of Christ going, but we have the simple fact that God, the Father, with his Son, are outside of time and space. They created it. Okay, he created this physical, even the whole universe that we live in. The first thing that there was spirit. God is spirit. He created this simulation of the physical for us to live in and to operate in and to exist so that we could come to the point that he wants us to build the character that's necessary, right? And again, all this stuff's going to come to naught. It's going to be rolled up like a scroll. But he gave us the years, months, the days, the seasons. And as we saw before with Joshua, He can suspend those things. Even somehow, some way, in a physical way, he did that. He gave Joshua the time that was necessary so that they could finish it. However that happened, I don't even want to try to figure out, don't even want to know. It happened. I know there's a lot of speculation as to how it happened and this, that, and the other thing, but no, it doesn't matter. God did it, okay? He can do it again if he wants to. Or do we go outside of this, space-time continuum, as a God being? What is it that we can do in an instant that seems, like time stops, or, that seems like years? We don't know. So even my point is, though, is that just looking at it from a physical perspective, there's plenty of time. That's not even taking into account what can happen at a spiritual level. All right, so now, finally, let's go back to Revelation 19 and the marriage supper. All right, so Revelation 19, this is kind of where we started. This is where we'll finish, in Revelation 19. In this chapter, there are a lot of telltale signs that point to the fact that those that are being spoken about throughout this whole chapter are those who come up in the first resurrection, right? Because we talked about, again, we started off this series, I think we started off pretty much over there in verses 7 through 9. Okay, those are the ones that we often quote. But I want to look at a few of the scriptures before and a few of them after, and just make a few points as to where these things are happening, okay? And who is saying what and who is doing what, right here. So we already know that we're talking about the wedding, the supper, the marriage here, and we'll go over that again as well. But so in Revelation 19 and verse 1, after these things I heard a loud voice of a great multitude. In the King James Version, it actually says people here, but multitude, peoples, crowd, it all has that same type of connotation. So multitude could still be a likely word, but if it was people, then you're going, okay, well, then that means, maybe something more. It means something other than the angelic realm or God. So it's in heaven. So I heard the voice of a great multitude in heaven. Okay, so we're not going to base everything just on this verse. Verse 2. And again, let me just say this too before I go on to verse 2, is that I'm not saying that heaven is the reward of the saved. That's not what we're saying here, right? We're just talking about a temporary thing, a time of going up to heaven for the ceremonies that need to be happening so that the Father can participate, because he's not going to go to earth. He needs to remain separate from sin for this time before everything is accomplished, before we go back down into the clouds. And again, how does this happen? Well, does it happen during the time of darkness? Or, God can come, he's outside of the physical realm, and, we can disappear and go there in an instant and come back, who knows, perhaps in an instant as well. So, verse 2, for true and righteous are his judgments, because he has judged the great harlot who corrupted the earth with her fornication, and he has avenged on her the blood of his servants shed by her. So who was it that the beast power, killed? Well, it's his servants. That's the subject here of what he is doing for his servants, the firstfruits, the saints, the elect, the called out ones, all the same. Verse 3. Well, let's skip verse 3 and go to 4. And then the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures fell down and worshiped God who sat on the throne. So again, once again, we have the location here. So verse 1 is heaven. Verse 4 is the throne of God, which also is in the third heaven. And then verse 5, a voice came from the throne saying, praise our God, all you servants, both small and great. And then verse 6, I heard, as it were, the voice of a great multitude. Once again, same words here, same words in the Greek, as the sound of many waters. And as the sound of mighty thundering, saying, hallelujah, for the Lord God omnipotent reigns. Now, it's interesting here that the great multitude is saying a sound of many waters, or that's what their voice sounds like. Whenever the Bible talks about the sound of many waters, right, it refers to God, right? You put Ezekiel 43:2 in your notes, Revelation 14:2, and then Revelation 1 and verse 15 is describing Christ. It says his feet were like fine brass, as refined in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. It's what the God being's voice sounds like. And so now you have a great multitude who sound the same. To me, it makes perfect sense that when we're resurrected into the God families and we become God like God is God, that is the way our voice is going to sound. And we're talking about this multitude, the 144,000, okay, that we talked about. They're going to return with him before from Revelation 14, which is talking about the first fruits, the 144,000, that they're going to sound like this voice or this sound of many waters. So to me, it stands to reason here. But moving on, now we go to verse 7 through 9, where we talk about the marriage supper. So again, we're talking about, okay, let's go ahead and take this, at face value here. We're talking about being in heaven. We're talking about the throne. Okay, we're talking about, the godlike voices. And then verse 7, he says, let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready. And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen. This is being given to the bride of Christ, the 144,000, the saints, etc. All the same peoples, right? It's being arrayed, is being granted, is being given to her to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright. For the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. So she's being dressed in righteousness, in this linen. And then he said to me, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said, these are the true sayings. So these people are blessed because they are at the marriage supper of the Lamb. So to me, it all stands to reason based on everything that we're talking about, that we're putting together, that this is the ceremony that is taking place in heaven. Notice verse 11 now. Now we've moved past the supper, okay, the marriage and the supper. Now I saw heaven opened. Where are we again? We're still in heaven, right? And behold, a white horse, and he who sat on him was called Faithful and True. And in righteousness, he judges and makes war. All right? This is what we've been talking about, is that he's returning to make war with the people of earth who are rebelling against him, who have been rebelling against him for the last 6,000 years. Because, okay, one, he's trying to bring everybody to repentance, but he also has the power of life and death. And I know that we haven't gone through the resurrections, and we're talking about the first resurrection, that the subject matter is a little bit higher level, and that we are, assuming that certain things. But the first resurrection of the saints, but there's a second and third resurrection as well that the Bible speaks about very clearly. And again, God has this plan of mercy that he's going to call everybody in their time and give them the opportunity. So he can bring these people back to life very easily, and he will in the future. And he's leaving a certain few alive to start over, to wipe the slate clean, to begin this millennial rule on earth, this paradise, this Eden recreated. So anyway, we see verse 11 that he's going to make war now. Okay, what we talked about. In verse 14, and the armies in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, followed him on white horses. So who's arrayed in fine linen? Verse 8, okay, that's the saints, the first resurrected. They are the armies in heaven that are being talked about here. And Jude even echoes this. If you want to keep your finger here for a second, Jude, which only has one chapter, verses 14 and 15. Jude, verses 14 and 15. Notice what he has to say about these armies that will return with Christ. Jude says, now Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men also saying, behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints. All right. So what is that? 14.4 of those tens of thousands? It's, again, tens of thousands. It's 144,000. And why? What's the purpose? What's happening here? Verse 15, to execute judgment on all. Again, we're going to become kings and priests and rule with Christ on earth. And part of this, part of our job, part of the things that we're going to have the authority to do is to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds which they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him, against God, how they blasphemed his name, how they use his name in vain, how they deny Christ at every turn. So we see then here that the armies are the tens of thousands of his saints that are coming from where? These armies are in heaven, clothed in linen. And he's returning out of heaven on his white horse, and we're going to be on our white horses with him. Verse 15 of Revelation 19. Now out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should strike the nations. Right? So again, we're going to look at the next two verses for context here. Okay, what is happening? Where is he going? Just to be clear, right? So it's not some other war or something that's going on. Out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should strike the nations, and he himself will rule them with a rod of iron. He himself treads the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. Again, that winepress imagery once again. When does that happen? We're talking about there in the valley of Kidron, the valley of Jehoshaphat. And he has on his robe and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He will be our King and our Lord. Even though we are kings and lords of lords, he will sit at the top, okay, just under the Father. So brethren, I think now, after 3 messages, to sum it up, we're going to be the bride of Christ. Okay? We're going to marry him. And we're going to do this in heaven before the Father. Okay? And it's going to happen right before his return to earth. So I hope that this has been a rewarding and enlightening series for you. It has for me. It's been exciting, and it always is, to go through the Word of God like we have done today.